All right, so today's presentation, I'm gonna do something on Ma'at, but an aspect of Ma'at that is not often talked about, which is termed Geru or Jeru Ma'at, sometimes just Geru or Ger. So I've called it Classical African Legacy through West African Heritage, and I'll just try to power through it as fast as possible without rushing too much. So start off asking, what is Ma'at, right? And we're all familiar with the many depictions of Ma'at in ancient Egyptian and really just pharaonic iconography. Um, Pretty much a linguistic inquiry. So on this screen, I give a little profile of each language. We're dealing with modern Wolof and ancient Egyptian. Both are language isolates for kind of different reasons. If we go by um, the mainstream linguistic categorization system. There's some others proposed by linguists like Obenga and Jean-Claude Molly, who use the BED or BERE system. Uh, Wolof would classify as a BER language and a BERE language in the Molly classification system. Uh, you guys are pretty much familiar with the geography of Africa, but we'll just point out that ancient Egypt is on the northeastern extremity of Africa, and Senegal is on the westernmost extremity of Africa. These languages are tested from 4000 BC, 3100 BC to 343 AD. Some may argue Wolof with, I don't know if you guys have heard of the word gorilla having etymological roots in Wolof. But some people argue that. I'm not really too crazy about that theory. But that would place things around 500 BC or so. Um, Otherwise, around 1300 AD is when the Wolof kingdom comes together. So we'd be talking about Wolof, Lebu, and those languages can be found in Mauritania, Gambia, Guinea, and Mali. And on the ancient Egyptian side, we're talking about Middle Egyptian. Um, and we can ask the question of what are the other dialects of ancient Egyptian? Uh, are there any living dialects that we may be overlooking in areas like Sudan, Libya, Chad, or Punt? But that's just a preamble before we really get into it. So why Mat in Senegal, West Africa? Oral records, first of all, right? Some of the earliest oral records and historical records done by Senegalese actually speak of, uh, we'll just say, northeastern relationships or relationships to ancient Egypt, right? So a word for records or oral records in Wolof is genut, which is similar to ancient Egyptian genut, and that's just to say that that puts us in familiar territory. A quote from Yodo Jiao, who is one of the earliest griots to have given an account of the history of Senegal, but also the migrations from ancient Egypt, has this to say. He says, this idolatry, speaking of the religious community of Senegal at the time, this idolatry, source of the Chedo state, let us call it Chedoism, social name in Senegambia, as well as for the Serer, as well as for the Wolof and the Serer, of all that are not Muslim and subscribe to this Egyptian mythology, no doubt in its corrupted form. Being that the general opinion in the entire Senegambia is that our country owes its peopling to migrations from Egypt, which descend all of its population. You can find this in Abu Bakr Musalam's book, the six migrations that came from the Nile, or the milestones of Yoro Jiao. Not really here to discuss whether that's true or not, But as we make these inquiries and we wonder why we're even talking about this in West Africa, as we often get those kinds of questions, it's good to give this kind of background. You'd also ask maybe what is Ma'at? And even back to the question of why Ma'at in West Africa, not only the oral records, but we have known figures in the scientific community like Sheikh Anta Diop, who have already established the beginning linkages for us in terms of ancient Egypt or classical Africa, to be more general, and West Africa or Senegal in specific. He offers a comparison between the word ma'at, word for word, an exact weight, and he offers wolof mat, poids exact, so an exact weight. Mati, the two truths, the name of two goddesses in the old kingdom, or in the kingdom of the dead. He compares to Mati, which is a proper name for women. So Diop already started making comparisons between Wolof and ancient Egyptian in terms of the question of Ma. And we can offer some additional comparisons here. You have ancient Egyptian Ma, orderly management, truth, justice, right doing, righteousness, justice. And Mat on one side, where the consonants have shifted a little bit, but you can still get the general sense. So on one end, you have bok, to share, mok, share, sharing, family, relative, and even totem. Muk, to move in a direction, political, official, mek, silence, immobility, and also mat, where matu, bowl, which is a representation of the cosmos, matit, which is a word for culture and tradition, bot, to carry the support, mbot, secret or truth, mbotai, group, organization, or association, and butit, intestines. So this is not saying that these words are all the words for what we call ma'at, but they are related terms. They're part of the same genealogy. So moving forward, we can show ma'at, orderly management, truth, right doing, righteousness, justice. The Coptic me, and me is sometimes pronounced ma. Truth, justice. Coptic met or mat, true, real. We can also point out Bambara Ma and Basa May, which I should have incorporated in this presentation. And these are all words for truth, reality, and things of that nature, which shows us that we're once again in a familiar universe, contrary to what many would have us think. When we come to Wolof, we can isolate the terms Mot, truth, secret, compared to ancient Egyptian Mat, true, real, and Wolof Ma, touch, behave, and Mao, flat view, a flat surface, and Mat, to be right, true, real, to be righteous, adequate, complete, whole, to be in order, harmonious, ready, fully developed, worthy. And yes, this word mat in Wolof does mean all these different things. And well, I'll just keep going. I'll just keep going. Another derivative of this term that you can also compare to ancient Egyptian is Middle Egyptian meti, straight, exact, correct, right, proper, precise, traditional, straightforward, to Wolof meti, hard, painful, rigorous, exact, consistent, to be right. Middle Egyptian mut, die, perish, be dead, sink of ship, go off, rot, become putrefactive. To Wolof mut, silence, which is an onomatopoeia, but you could also compare it to Wolof mud, which means a cadaver. or a corpse. So that was to give a quick, just linguistic kind of background to give us some deeper ideas on what Mat is in this context. And we go back to the question of what is Mat, and oftentimes in the conversation, Mat is reduced maybe to like one thing. People say, "Oh, Mat is truth," or "Mat is balance, justice," you know. But when we really think about it, Mat is this thing that really permeates the entire society of these cultures. So we find it in these different realms of the social life, the legal life, the cosmic reality, in the religion, in culture, and in everyday life, and even in war and conflict. Um, all of us here are probably familiar with the 42 Declarations of Innocence. This is a very, very, I guess you could say, major aspect of Ma'at, right? So as the daughter of Re, Ma'at was also the sister of the reigning king, who was the son of Re, and the relationship of the goddess with the king was a vital one. Both the monarch's legitimation and the efficacy of his reign were ultimately based upon the degree to which he upheld Ma'at, and it was common, therefore, for kings to style themselves as beloved of Ma'at. So this is another aspect of Ma'at where the king um, is a figure that represents the nation, and his offering of Ma'at is key to the well functioning of the universe. And this, I guess you could say, also speaks to the fact that there are no giant temples to Ma'at, as some may think, but it's one of those things that is so uh, permeating the society to an extent that perhaps there was no need for a giant temple to Ma'at, because Ma'at was expected to be in everything. As such, we have images of the kings holding rebels and enemy soldiers, right? This is also Ma'at, right? All of these are examples of, I guess, what we can call Ma'at, from the sciences on down. So a question naturally comes, does Ma'at still exist as an important religious, spiritual, or philosophical term in Senegal, particularly in the Wolof language? And we've gone over kind of that idea already, comparing Ma'at, orderly management, truth, justice, right doing, righteousness, justice, to Wolof Mat, to be right, true, real, righteous, adequate, etc. Right? We can go over some common expressions with Ma'at or Mat in Wolof. In Wolof, you may hear someone say, "Nit matu." Humans are imperfect. People are not Mat, right? So people are not always right. People are not always whole. Really, is what is communicated. Um, but many of these examples could apply given the context. Another is mat japena. Mat is difficult, right? So to be right, to be righteous, to be exact, to be adequate, to be all of these things is a difficult thing. And usually this is said to a person in on a sympathetic level, right? Or an empathetic level. If someone is trying to do a lot or is trying to be the best that they can, one may offer the phrase, wow, mat japena, you know, mat is difficult. During their daily discourse, when the Wolof declare ken matu, or none are perfect, or mat japena, perfection is difficult, it is not to condemn someone, but to preach indulgence or to make an invitation towards humility. They know quite well that, in fact, Whatever the progress might have been in the mastery of self and of loyalty towards moral and religious precepts, we are not free from mishap. Man cannot attain absolute perfection. There is between him, perfect being, the distance between finite and infinite. This is why the Wolof sage never ceases to preach modesty and indulgence, and very often insists on the necessity to cover the weaknesses of others by a veil of pudor and discretion, sutura. And even this word sutura can be contested because there is a version of this word in Arabic, but it seems to have a completely different etymological root. And we find the same use of it in ancient Egyptian with setra, or however we would like to pronounce it, um, meaning utterance. Popular quote is Senegal is 95% Muslim, 5% Christian, yet 100% animist. And I think that's a healthy quote to have when we look at this idea of morality and beliefs in traditional societies, especially in Senegal. So the following quote is from a very famous religious leader in Senegal who is Muslim. But what I'm showing here actually illustrates how powerful really um, the traditional uh, the traditional fabric is, because it still seeps through um, other layers that we might think are foreign and accept. But anyway, um, Banyas here states, "Mat dëgg mooy lépp lu dul yàlla, doo ko gis, doo ko gestu, doo ko xool, doo ko yitewo, doo ko xelaat." So true mat is all that is not God. You will not see it. You will not reflect upon it. You will not look it over. You won't make it your issue. You will not think of it. On one hand, this may seem like a very almost maybe monastic kind of Islamic calling, but it's very African when you think about it, and it's asking, I guess, the listener to see Ma'at in all that they do. And in Wolof itself, often people will say things like expressions like Mam Yala, right? And Mam Yala is a term that is an expression that means ancestor God, literally, right? Even grandmother or grandfather God. And such a statement is actually quite antithetical to many Islamic principles when we go into it. And the point is not to just uh, show things that are antithetical, but it's to show again that these traditions, even through things like this, seep through. And Bainyas is also considered a strong and staunch Pan-African leader amongst the religious leaders of Senegal. So going into part two, what is Ma'at for everyday life and how do we know? Once again, we can go through the works of Diop, and we are fortunate enough to be able to go through the written Seba left for us by the ancient Egyptians themselves. Um, so Seba written teaching, instructions, guidance. Um, Once again, we are not in unfamiliar territory. This root you can find in Wolof as well. In Coptic, it would give us Sebui, meaning disciple or pupil. In Wolof, you have Sofe, student, pupil, or understudy. Um, Depending on pronunciation, this can also just be Sope. And I get some examples here that people may be familiar with. Sofa sitting Tuwa, Sofa sitting Salu, Sofa sitting Falu. These can be confused to me sometimes admirer of, right? But what happens is that this is usually in a religious context. So supper means someone's understudy, someone who either an understudy or a professor in a religious sense. So hence you'll see it on posters, at various stores on the back of the karapid, which are the trotros of Senegal. And we can go into, of course, scholars like James P. Allen, his Middle Egyptian text. And he informs us that these instructions include a wide range of advice from correct social behavior to proper conduct towards superiors and subordinates. Their purpose is the transmission of Ma'at, right and proper behavior, both for its own sake and as the key to a happy and successful life. The individual who lives according to Ma'at is often described as Gef, or however we would like to pronounce it, the quiet man or the still man, that is the calm and self-effacing person, or Rech, the knowledgeable man, as opposed to Wecha, the fool. And just in passing, I don't include that here, but Rech, the knowledgeable man, is not unfamiliar territory. Rach is a word in Wolof which means to be mixed, but it can also be mean to be imbued with knowledge. Wecha, the fool, can be compared to Wolof Wach and the root Wach. To Wahu someone is to fool someone. So moving forward, we'll go into La morale de l'honneur dans les sociétés Wolof et Alpularen traditionnelles, right? By Professor Boubacar Lee, PhD. Lee confirms in the Senegambia that in the parts of this country inhabited by the Wolof, the right of property is recognized in someone by custom on behalf of the fact that it is either him or his ancestors who have cleared and founded the land upon which the village is settled, or that the inhabitants who live there farm the land under the authorization of the owner. In general, the blacks recognize that they are not originally, in the absolute sense of the word, from the regions in which they currently live. When they arrived, during a time which their memory has not been able to discern by one means or another, these regions were covered with immense forests. The more valiant set themselves to cutting down the trees, cutting down the bush, and clearing out vast spaces where they established fields and sowed the earth. Later, other exoduses brought populations that lived side by side with them on those same lands, naturally recognizes them as having the rights of first occupants of the land where they were installed. Thus, Gor, as applied to the virtue which man can possess, comes from there. Primitively, it could have meant the one who was cut down or cleared to inhabit, cultivate, and live honestly of his labor, who owes not anything to anyone, basically a free man. So this is really interesting, right? Because we have James P. Allen, who is definitely not a specialist in the Wolof language or Northwest Atlantic languages, and we have Professor Boubacar Lee, who is certainly not an Egyptologist, and yet uh, the accounts that they have on both of these terms are very, very similar. So in Middle Egyptian, we have Ger, or God for sake of conversation, one who lives according to Ma'at, silent man, quiet man, self-effacing man, tolerant man, honorable man, free man, in parentheses, because you don't really find it translated as free man in the Medu Netcher. And we compare that to Wolof Gor, one who lives according to Mbatit, restrained man, quiet man, tolerant man, honorable man, free man, one who prefers death to subjugation, slavery, and colonization. Indeed. So I point out that Ma'at is often written with this sickle glyph as a preferred way, seemingly, of writing the word Ma'at, or even Ma, truth. And it brings to mind the fact that this idea of cutting the bushes, of clearing the land, of founding a settlement, right, um, is centrally important to these kinds of society. And this imagery will pop back up in the presentation as we go on. So I set out kind of a timeline or somewhat of a semantic historical map on these different terms. So you have Gareg, settle to establish a settlement, Wolof Gor to settle establishment, etc., and the term Garak, which in Yodo Jao's, the griot that we mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, in Yodo Jao's account, the first settlement that they establish when they arrive on the banks of the river is called Garak. So that's an interesting parallel right there. So you have the other parallel of God, founder, ancestor, but I have a number sign there because there'll be more explanation as to why that assertion is made in the presentation. You have God, silent man, quiet man, still self-controlled, the tolerant man, God, silent man, self-control, really the same kind of idea. And then God, free man, man of value, man of distinction, man who prospered from his land of his ancestors. Once again, I have a number sign there because you don't really find that in the text. You don't find it defined in that way. You find more just silent man, although Egyptologists do agree that um, silence is really kind of a metaphor for another kind of way of being. And in Senegambia, you have a similar kind of thing. So a question becomes this idea of those who prefer death to enslavement and colonization, honorable man. Was that sense of the term present in the ancient Egyptian text? There are actually a few different variations of God that are interesting, and it would be interesting to know if they do show up in the ancient Egyptian language. Just have some examples from different languages here. You have Coptic, Gorkef, silent, quiet, Gerok, quietness, tranquility, Herok, be still, cease, be quiet, Gulani Gorko, plural Warbe, male, uh, courageous person, valiant person. Um, so you do find this term in some languages, meaning either silent or to sit or something of that nature. But what seems particular about the Wolof uh, comparison is that God is said to be an entire kind of honor system, which even goes back to this idea of it being tied to those who refuse colonization and all this kind of stuff. It was very closely associated to the Chedo, who was something like the Senegalese samurai, because they were known to either kill themselves or go to extreme measures. Uh, so the term is depicting the silent man, the calm man, or a sitting man, his hands to his mouth. The term geru, or geru ma'a is translated variably in English as the silent, quiet, calm, still, self-controlled, honorable, masterful, or tolerant man, which we can compare to Wolof Gor and the form Gormal, which really means to honor. And it seems like it has just been made to turn into a causative form. So C informs us that for the moment we can hold on to the knowledge that Ngor, such as it relates to us, is characterized by values of honesty, Maat, pretty much the honesty that is founded upon honor and liberty. God is on the moral level a total phenomenon, as it implicates all the other moral virtues. All the virtues, Asadi tells us, converge towards the Ngor. and only constitute different aspects of it. God is a feeling and at the same time a moral principle of action. Intervenes in order to accomplish not only fundamental will of values, which we have analyzed, but also in the accomplishment of daily acts of all kinds. He goes on to quote Major Kobes, who defines God as faith, fervor, honesty, pudor, decency, politeness, and urbanity. So having said all of this and having looked at these different examples, it's really something else to be able to look at ancient Egyptian texts and read about the early developments of this kind of concept. Um, Although some Egyptologists postulate that this notion of Geru may have been of pre-dynastic origin, other Egyptologists seem to point that you can really track the development of this term throughout the Kemetic, throughout the Pharaonic era, and um, the way that it's used reflects greatly the way Egypt was administrated, the way their culture was in terms of morality and these kinds of questions. So the God silent man is central theme in Egyptian literature. It is first mentioned in the instruction to Kagemni in the Middle Kingdom, although the authors attribute its authorship to the sixth dynasty. Right? The text dates to much later than much. The text dates to the much later 12th dynasty of the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, perhaps by the reign of Amenemhat II from 1929 BC to 1985 BC, or a bit later in the 12th dynasty. Right, so they postulate that they kind of backdated it to some extent. Some examples of this concept being used in the text: the reserved man prospers, the man of exactitude is praised, the tent is open to the silent man, the place of the calm man is wide. Instruction to Kagem. He knows when to keep silent and when to speak. Having nothing to say, one should remain silent. If you are a respected man who sits in his master's council, concentrate on excellence. Be silent. Correct. Because it is more profitable than chattering. Speak only when you know. It is the skilled who should speak in council. Speaking is harder than any craft. Only he who understands it controls. Instructions of Ptah Hotel. And there are a few of these examples. I don't have to read them all, but it's once again just really interesting to be able to look at these concepts from one place to the next. I'll just read this one and we can kind of power through the next. An Egyptian textbook named Kemet the Complete from the beginning of the second millennium BCE, which was the first textbook ever produced. The author praises himself in these words: "I am a most excellent Ger or Geru, conquering the heat of him who opens his lips. I am not a chatterer." Right? And there are many more examples where this term is used. As for Guru Neb in the temple, they say, "Great is the benevolence of Re. Cling to the Guru, silent man, that you will find life and your body will prosper upon earth." You know, and I find these valuable because a lot of times people talk a lot about the religious texts, and very seldomly do people bring up these uh, moral texts that are very accessible, right? And in many ways speak to a lot of it. So the Gur appears to have been a very model of the traits and qualities that were the heart's desire of the wise man, both on the social level and in the realm of the religion and faith. He is restrained in speech and argument. He is modest and obedient to those above him. And finally, he is the ideal pious man who is devoted to his God. The opposite of the silent man is not the talker, but an agglomeration of negative qualities and defects connected with excessive activity and lust. which constitute the personality of the hot-tempered man. So on Gar in the Senegambia, we go to Professor Hassan Silla, PhD, La Philosophie Morale de Wolof. Okay. And he tells us that it suffices only to gaze over the proverbs on the rules of well-being, on the educational principles, to get an adequate and detailed formulation of Wolof morality. It can be resumed in the following schema. One, to be master of oneself, to be able to conserve, be it in joy or in adversity, the qualities of God, to make proof in all circumstances of the qualities of God. That is to say, to be you, correct, estimable in one's behavior and in one's language, to be gore, to be honest and able to face one's social duties and especially the sacrifices which they may imply, to be mandu, to have the capacity to resist temptation and by consequence lead a life above the mishaps and sins which degrade the individual and which render him unworthy of the esteem and trust of one's peers, right? 4, to maintain oneself within the affairs of various social milieus, family, age group, professional group, etc., at the same level of respectability as his knowledge, as his social ranking group. Thus, to force oneself to succeed like them, to take on the same rights and the same duties, and never accept to be demerited in relation to them. 5, avoid at all costs any dishonor which would provoke irreparable chaos. So, as you can see, this notion of Gor in the Senegambia is actually quite detailed and has certain stipulations and rules and things of that nature. Um, what's what was really interesting to me when I came across this is the fact that, and me personally having grown up in Senegal, I knew about the God tradition. I knew about just the idea of God, but it's not something that's very much expounded upon. So coming into Kemetic consciousness, if I may say, um, really allows you a different kind of perspective. But nonetheless, looking at this instantly brought me back to one of the books that I first read when I started entertaining ancient Egyptian information. And that is from George G.M. James, Stolen Legacy. The 5 um, principles that we have just outlined from Asan Silla, which are just from that author. Uh, Going back, I hope to do some kind of field research and document what some other elders have to say before they also pass away. But we find that George G.M. James outlined a very similar some very similar notions in his description of the Egyptian mystery system and the life of virtue that was required by the priests for their neophytes to maintain, right? So control of thought and control of action, the combination of which Plato called justice, steadfastness of purpose, identity with spiritual life and higher ideals, which was the equivalent of temperance, evidence of having a mission in life, and evidence of a call to a spiritual orders of its priesthood and the mysteries, freedom from resentment. And, many will say that his background was Masonic and all of these kinds of things, but I find it very interesting that so many times many of our scholars are so close to the mark. And when you look into the data, especially in West Africa, it does nothing but really confirm what they were talking about. So Maheru to the ancestor George M. James, Matjafena. So the term God can be associated with the following terms: kese, respectability, humility, jum, pula, rafet, teranga, tabets. Many of these words are words that exist in the ancient Egyptian language, like kudu, character, to kick, to kickstart, activate, to build, seng, to be brave, having predisposition to action, ham aduna, to know the world, to have khel, mind, to have thoughts, to be jadu, to be righteous, to be right and enduring, to be yewen, clement, generous, be disposed to give. So these are all important principles in the God tradition, as I've been able to draw from at least two authors. And we can compare some of the Kemetic literature that we've seen with some of the Wolof proverbs and proverbs from other places as well. I've just honed in onto the Wolof because they are one of the groups that I'm most familiar with. So Niku Water Don Got to Buddy Buck, a real sure, dependable, a great person who is of honor will not have many debts. Kukheb Samu Wanyinga Songo. He who belittles his luck, you have diminished your honor. Kudiloham Wako Songor Yap. One given to speaking all that they know, your honor will be ruled. Ngormodi leka, surul wujuki. Honorable is one who eats, is not full, forgets of. Nyara di defi jamu ci aduna, ngor ak julit. Two things provide peace in this world, honor and piety. Mbuga du mat, ngor mat. Desire cannot be complete while honor is fulfilled. Kusa buga bare, sangor new. Whomever's desires are many, your honor is faint. So those are some of the uh, um, proverbs that we can associate with the idea of Ngor and Maat in the Wolof context. Here is just a stele from the chief craftsman Karo, who prays to Amun Re, Mut, and Kansu. And I think I'm gonna just skip over this one, but it's just really giving us more of an idea of how Geru Ma'a or Gor is used in the Kemetic text. So to part 3. And we hone in on the question of Gor, the silent man, the honorable man, those who prefer death to enslavement and colonization. And we come into an interesting, a pretty cool point of interest, right? The Neb Seger, right? The Lord of Silence. And well, if you might even be able to say the Nabusagat. Right? So in the Book of the Dead, you find this quote: "Homage to thee, maker of the gods, Osiris, Ma Keru, Ger, or Gor of the worlds, or of the two lands, in his gracious season. He is the Lord of the world." Right? So in this instance, you can see God being used. Budge translates it as master, and I think Golit also translates it as master or something of that nature. But you could also translate it as founder, right, or founding ancestor, right. Um, we can translate this hieroglyph as master of the world, the more precisely master of the earth or master of the two lands. Otherwise, it spreads designating Osiris as Gortawi, right, God of the two lands. And if we look at many of the accounts of Osiris, even in the Hellenistic time, he's described to us as a founding ancestor of the Kemetic civilization. And this is a notion that we find with what I and others have called Osirian types, Osirian deities in West Africa, especially in the Senegal. So following that question on Gar and the idea of colonization, we know that Egypt eventually fell, right? But Mark Smith points out that there were even in the very late period, way after Nectanebo and these kinds of guys, there were rebellious figures like Harwenefer and Ankwenefer from 205 to 186 BC. And then we have Pet-O Serapis, Dionysios, 168 BC. And in 132 to 131 BC, you have Hadesisis or Seosiris at 132, 131 BC. And all of these characters are using the name of Osiris in their titles, or using the title of North, however you say it. They're using this title in their name because, in a sense, Osiris has become a revolutionary deity, and in a sense, it always was to an extent, because Osiris represents proper kingship and rightful kingship. So, in that sense, when these gentlemen chose those names to represent themselves, more than likely, that is the notion that they were alluding to. And I think I might have skipped over the part in saying that the Lord of Silence in ancient Egyptian texts is Osiris, and it is also closely associated with the god Amun, the Neb Geru. Ultimately, this concept has a long history from the Old Kingdom in the middle of the third millennium, ending with the Demotic instructions in Hellenistic time. So another expression, another common expression, Kenamatu. No, none are perfect, none are mod. So move into West Africa with it. Gore Island. Good Reed Island, the place of memories, or the Isle of the Gulf, which is the proper uh, understanding of the word Gore Island. In this excerpt here, essentially, so on their refusal to surrender, the entrance was blocked off until the next day, when it was made quite clear to them that if they did not immediately end their rebellion, they would be burnt alive where they were. They decided to give in, and immediate steps were taken against those regarded as the ringleaders. Two of them were shot on the spot, while a third was stretched out in two pieces of wood and quartered in front of his dumbfounded companion. Such cruelty did not snuff out rebellion. In 1755, a further uprising was attempted on Gore Island by the prisoners of war who had been sold by the King of Sea. He had been at war with the King of Bawo. Although beaten on the battlefield, the King of Sin decided to take his revenge. During the night, when the victors were feasting and celebrating, the Sin warriors took them by surprise. Some Bawo generals, including Farah Kaba, were killed. 500 other warriors were taken prisoner and immediately sold to Gore to rule out any possibility of retaliation. Once on Gore, the captives decided to rebel in hope of returning to their homeland. Their plan was that one-third of them would, on the way back to the detention quarters in the evening, throw themselves on the guards, seize the weapons from soldiers' racks, and kill the 12 guards. At the time, another third would enter the fort and seize the armory, the stock of weapons, and the powder store. The remaining third were to massacre the whites so that nothing could thwart the plan, and so that once they were uh, masters of the fort and of the island, they could all arm themselves with the guns and ammunition, carry off the finest, most valuable, and least bulky merchandise, and finally go down to the shore, board the longboats, and cross over to the mainland. This plan was not even embarked upon, for a child who had overheard the conspirators alerted the commandant of Gore. Commandant assembled the captives in the courtyard of the fort and asked the two leaders of the conspiracy whether it was true that they had decided to massacre the European population of Gore. They replied that it was, while stressing that it was not out of hatred for the Europeans, but simply so that no one could oppose their flight. They added that they were all ashamed not to have died fighting, and since their attempt had failed, they demanded to be killed because death was preferable to slavery. This forthrightness was to no avail. By decision of the council of the company, the two ringleaders were cannonaded before the eyes of their terrified companions. The others were put aboard a vessel from La Rochelle commanded by Captain Avillon. Gore Island of Memories, UNESCO, 1985. So this is giving an example of that principle in action, right? And unfortunately, although some honor may have been preserved during a brief moment, not prevent uh, those Africans from being trafficked to the New World. But anyway, from a linguistic perspective, it's easy to see how good raid becomes gore. So officially, the name gore is attributed to the name good raid, and just over time morphed to what we call gore. But I could assure you that 90% of Senegalese are completely ignorant of that. And as this author points out here, Korea Njai, uh, I should admit that the origin of the word gore has well been studied, but for Senegalese, word bears another symbolic meaning as sustained by the Wolof language. Indeed, the word gore does exist in Wolof and is polysemic, gore, being an adjective that refers to the quality of a person who is physically free as opposed to being a slave. At the same time, it designates a person who has high and noble value. If we take a close look at its variants, the word gar refers to man, manhood, and courage. As a verb, it refers to the idea of cutting loose with violence or separating an element from where it belongs, the way one would chop a branch from a tree. And I thought this to be very powerful um, because in this sense, Gore Island is actually the island of the Gar. Gore Island is actually the island of the Geru Maa. And from that paragraph, we're reminded of the idea of Ma, the sickle, and clearing the fields, right? And we're reminded of this idea of the Lord of Silence and what this idea of Gar meant to these different populations. So Gore, Isle of the Gar, is better understood as those who lived according to Matit, the restrained men, the silent men, the tolerant men, the honorable men, those who emulated the greatness of their forebears, the dignified ones, the free men, the ones who preferred death to subjugation, slavery, and colonization. Right. So in closing, this idea of gar in Senegambian society, unfortunately, is definitely on the decline. That doesn't mean that they're not honorable people in Senegal, but the entire tradition of associating that term with certain deeds and consistent habits and formularities is that has definitely declined. And from that, you have this expression, God Amatul, right? The God are no more. This is a common expression when people watch movies about old great black, revolutionaries or old great Senegalese warriors. They say, God Amatul, you know. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that a lot of that may also have to deal with slavery and the reality of quality people being drained from a place, right? Most of the Senegalese Europeans trafficked to the U.S. went to South Carolina, Georgia, and the Gulf Coast, a highlighted number in Louisiana, followed mainly by Virginia and Maryland. These places imprisoned thousands of people from present-day Senegal and the American Gullah, and were a significant minority relative to the West and Central African population there, people from the Gambia being numerous between 1712 and 1719. Europeans trafficked Senegalese and Guineans to those places probably because those people had the agricultural expertise to make rice plantations flourish due to the prevalence of rice cultivation in Senegambia and the Guinea. Okay. The flip side of God, right? Be not mute, but yet be cautious of offending. When you answer a speech angry, turn away your face and control yourself, for the flames of the hot heart spread. And this term that they use for hot heart, ta'ib, or ta'ab, however we would like to pronounce it, ta'jib, uh, correlates to Wolof, tangajap, tangajap, hot-hearted, hot-tempered, right? And in Senegal, it's extremely looked down upon to do as the young folks say, come out of your body. To lose control of your to lose self-control is very very much looked down upon, especially in the context of the traditional gor uh, uh, concept, right? So the hot-tempered man is the opposite of the silent man in all areas of life. On the social level and on the plane of human relationships, the main transgression of the hot-tempered man is the inability to control his tongue. Speech is similar to fire. It is a flame in the answer of the ignorant. It is radiant of seat in the Speech is similar to fire. It is a flame in the answer of the ignorant. It is radiant of seat in the mouth of the silent. Right. The general sense of this metaphor, despite the corruption of the passage and the problems of interpretation, is understandable. Speech is a double-cut weapon, dangerous when handled by the ignorant, effectual and brilliant when used by the silent man. Although worn out by a week of denied communication, the peasant has still in mind this traditional significance of silence and proudly aligns himself with the Geru, the righteous and respectful man par excellence, who raises his voice only when matters are critical. Right. Although I do think many times Egyptologists do take an over literal um, approach to this idea of silence rather than some other kind of understanding, which is more so reservedness, right, or self mastery. Right. So nitmatu, humans are imperfect, and we can note that the Kemetic legacy, we can say, has been very prominent in the diasporan African experience and history, right out of slavery with Antenor Fearman, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Martin Delany. Booker T. Washington, Garvey as well. I believe Vanessa Davies is an author who speaks very a lot about these relationships. But when I think of the great people in our societies today, I do believe that they inherit directly from these systems and from these concepts, and we just recycle them through the ages and apply them to um, our realities as need be. These are just some images that show examples of the Kemetic legacy being celebrated in the African American diasporian African community. And I think the last part is here the idea of Maat in AAVE, right? To be right, righteous, exact, adequate, complete, whole, equal, level, perfect, to be in order, harmonious, ready, fully developed, worthy. Um, I found it interesting the ways in which in African American speech we use the word straight. You know, we use straight to the point where it's almost like a tonal word. Depending on the tone that someone asks you if you're straight, it can mean whether you are okay, whether you try to fight, whether, you know, it can mean a number of different things. But this idea of straightness um, seems very prominent in African American thought. And I think we see that a lot in just everyday speech. And if these concepts are concepts that existed in West Africa, it's not far-fetched at all to think that these ideas have evolved uh, in the diaspora to fit the reality in which people live in. And even our use of of words like real is kind of telling, you know. And it's the same thing in Wolof. Um, when someone does when someone does something, commits an action that is contrary to community value, someone can say, "Yo, little duguat," and that means this is not this person. What they're doing is not true. Although what they just did is an act; it wasn't a statement, you know, at all. But they'll say that what this person just did was untrue. It's an untruth, and that means to say that what this person did is not real. You know, it's not conform to the community value. You know, and it's not conform to the values that the community has agreed are positive and progressive. So I think with that, that kinds of end things. And I'll leave with the quote, greatest mod lasting in effect, undisturbed since the time of Osiris, for one punishes the breakers of laws, though the greedy one overlooks this. While baseness may seize riches, crime never lands its wares. In the end, it is mod that lasts. Man says, it is my father's ground. And here are just some of the things that we were able to go over. Mat in ancient Kemet and in modern Senegal. God as an embodiment of Mat in Kemet and Senegal. God as a literary tradition both in Kemet and Senegal. God as likely being an Osirian virtue. Uh, Questions are, how does the wisdom tradition, which only emerges and develops at best in the sixth dynasty of ancient Kemet, find its manifestation in modern Senegal in form and in name, and its other variations in other places as well, as we've seen with the Fulani and the Bambara? Does this mean a form of Maat survived Islamic and Christian hegemony and was later brought to the Americas by Africans who were caught in the transatlantic slave trade? How does this help our ancestors? How did this help our ancestors? And how can we apply this to benefit our circumstances today in North America? A few sources that I have here, and I believe that is it. Thank you for your time and allowing me to present. Hotep.